Thank you very much for that. If there's other people who want to come in, feel free. We won't bite. It's great to be here, and in a way, in celebration of one of the great entrepreneurs of Virginia had the guts to run for Congress. I put Anthony Flaccavento's picture on the front here in his previous incarnation of running Appalachian Sustainable Development. My own involvement with food goes back many years to my days as an undergraduate at Stanford. And in a moment of desperation, I decided to take a special, well-paying job promoting a food item that actually was very much in the news last week, and that is Twinkies. And it was an unusual job because not only did I have to promote Twinkies at the local supermarket, but I actually had to dress up as a Twinkie. So I had to put on yellow tights and a big plywood costume with a large cowboy hat, kind of looking like this. And I was walking up and down the aisle saying, "Do you know that Twinkies are now individually wrapped for freshness? That I should become a spokesperson for local food suggests how far anyone can go in this field." But Twinkies, sadly, Twinkies are going to be with us for a while. What I would like to talk about tonight is really three things. One is to share a study that Leslie Schaller and I and another fellow who's not here named Brad Massey did in Cleveland 2 years ago. Because I think this study still for me summarizes a lot of the kind of global thinking that we ought to have about local food, both the opportunities and the challenges that we face around it. Then I want to share a little bit from a study that I did around at the same time with the Wallace Center on competitive models of local food, because it really goes to the argument of, can local food compete on price? And then finally, I want to suggest some very specific initiatives that I've seen communities undertake around local food that have a prayer of paying for themselves. Because it's easy for us to spin out lots of ideas that, cost lots of money that we then ask foundations or government agencies to pay for. But more challenging are, what are things that pay for themselves? You may have noticed that I have, depending on your perspective, either the advantage or the misfortune of being the first person on your program tomorrow, which is an interesting challenge. And what I decided to do is to focus nearly all of my thoughts about local investment, which is where my new book is on tomorrow. So it's not that I will be negligent about investment tonight, it's that I'm going to save some of the good stuff for the second opportunity to talk tomorrow. So let me begin in Cleveland. Every place is represented by a person. Some people just come to embody different places. And I think for much of the world, Drew Carey is the embodiment of Cleveland. And he says this himself. He says, "As you know, I am from Cleveland, Ohio. I love Cleveland, Ohio. I based my whole career on being from Cleveland, Ohio." We know Drew Carey is heavy, bespectacled, irreverent, audacious, but what we don't appreciate about him is that he almost died. He said, "I always thought I was going to die before I was 60. My father died of a heart attack in his 40s. I'm not an idiot. The writing was on the wall." Now, if you've seen Drew Carey lately, he dropped 100 pounds because he committed himself to eating fresh, organic, healthy, local food. Parade magazine, writing about this Drew Carey transformation, wrote, quote, "Ultimately, Carey's most profound triumph can't be seen in a number on the scale or a bell size. Rather, it's the gift of a long and healthy future." And I think the transformation of Carey, to me, was a great metaphor for the kind of transformation that local food not only could perform for a once smokestack industrial city like Cleveland, but actually has performed. By the time we did our study, Cleveland was already getting a lot of attention. A website that some of you may be familiar with called Sustain Lane, that does ratings of communities around the country based on their sustainability behavior, ranked Cleveland #2 in local food around the country. They wrote, "Cleveland takes second place in our bake-off with 12 farmers markets and 225 community gardens reported, serving truckloads of fresh food to its population of over 450,000, a nearly 600% increase in the total number of farmers markets, and a sizable increase in community gardens since 2006, explain Cleveland's ascent in the rankings category." That was 2010, and since then, a tidal wave of activity has occurred. So in a sense, Cleveland probably could be #1 right now. And there's really remarkable stuff in the region. In the city of Cleveland itself, some of the largest urban farms in the United States can be found. One of the farms actually employs more than 100 developmentally disabled adults. In nearby Youngstown, Ohio, there's a whole urban homesteading movement to take over blighted properties and convert them into farms. Oberlin is part of the Cleveland area as well. Oberlin as a school was one of the first universities to fully embrace local food and local sourcing in its university food provisions. Its students have gone on to start a bunch of really interesting businesses, including Full Circle Biofuels. And then if you go to Worcester, another town in the greater Cleveland area, they have a really wonderful co-op there, kind of producer and consumer-run co-op called Local Roots, which I view as sort of the next generation of farmers markets, because farmers can drop off stuff there without wasting an entire day, and the stuff gets sold directly to people who come into the store. Leslie, myself, and Brad were given by the Cleveland Foundation a very simple mission: analyze what would be the impacts of a 25% shift toward local food. What would be the benefits? What would be the obstacles? And how could you proceed to achieve it? And we were asked not to just look at Cleveland per se, but to look at the region, 16 surrounding counties. And I think the biggest finding of our work was that a 25% shift toward local food would create 27,000 new jobs, enough in principle to reemploy 1 in 7 unemployed workers in that region. Now that number turns out, I've done these studies now in about a dozen places around the United States, and that turns out to be about the magnitude that a 25% shift toward local food accomplishes in chipping away at unemployment. What we can say is that we know that local food would probably be, if you could achieve a 25% shift, this would probably be the most significant stimulus that could possibly come to this area or any other area that implemented this policy. But it's not just jobs. It is a range of other benefits. Now here I have to pause for a second and clarify the meaning of local, because some people say, well, okay, local food. If Walmart sells food from local farmers, that would be another way of achieving the same thing. And it doesn't work like that, because the economic benefits come in part from the proximity, so it matters a little bit the distance from farm to table. But what's equally important is that all of the businesses along the way, for collection, for processing, for packaging, for distribution, for delivery, for restaurants, for grocery stores, all of those institutions need to be locally owned to gain these economic benefits, because local businesses spend more of their money locally. Among the other benefits that the 25% shift would accomplish in Cleveland would be about $1 billion in new wages, $4 billion of expanded output, $125 million in new state and local taxes collected. And there were other things that we didn't know quite how to put a dollar value on it, but we knew they were significant. Local food expands opportunities for food tourism. It becomes a magnet for other businesses. You know, many businesses are interested in attracting cultural creatives, and cultural creatives love local food. The local food revolution invites a new generation of entrepreneurship. By pulling 27,000 people off the unemployment rolls, we have to pay $127 million fewer in unemployment benefits. So the combination of additional taxes collected and fewer unemployment benefits leads to $250 million of additional money into state and local government that improves fiscal health, allows for capital improvements, rural development, and plus there's just the general economic security from being less vulnerable to food catastrophes far away. And there were benefits that we didn't try to put really any numbers around, except we know they're huge. We know that somewhere between 1/3 and half of the kids living inside the city of Cleveland are suffering from obesity and type 2, you know, in danger of type 2 diabetes. And solving these food deserts is a critical priority of local health institutions like the Cleveland Clinic. And they have made local food a priority because they understand that getting local food, fresh fruits and vegetables into the hands of families throughout inner city Cleveland is key for long-term vitality of the city. There's the issue of the global image. This was our image of Cleveland for much of the 20th century. You may recall that the river, the Cuyahoga River, spontaneously combusted. It was so badly polluted. In fact, there was a folk song written about it called Burn On Cuyahoga. Now I think people's image of Cleveland is really more summarized by, Iron Chef Michael Simons. That Cleveland has kind of established itself as this interesting foodie place. And then there are environmental benefits. We know that farmers are the principal stewards of the land, so promotion of responsible farming in the region is an environmental plus. But within the city, the expansion of urban farming leads to the cleanup of blighted plots. It helps to control rodents. It improves air quality. It reduces the presence of insects. It's good for diminishing the amount of pollution that's running off into the water. But another factor is, of course, carbon footprint. Carbon footprint matters with local food because if you think about it, if you're buying your food locally, it doesn't travel very far to get to you. So the farm-to-table issue matters there. And because, you know, most local food businesses are spending their money locally, the inputs going into those businesses also are not traveling long distances. So it really kind of logically follows that, by and large, the more you can localize your food system, the less food gets hauled around thousands of miles, and the less of a carbon footprint it has. Now, I have a picture here of the berserk sheep, because somewhere around 2008, 2009, there was a spate of articles saying, well, this argument about carbon footprint is kind of generally true, but there are so many contradictions that we can't really take it seriously. And the New York Times published an op-ed where the writer, a historian from Texas, argued a study has just been published in New Zealand that shows that if you live in the United Kingdom and were eating New Zealand lamb, that lamb would have 1/4 the carbon as lamb that was produced in the United Kingdom. Therefore, local lamb is bad for the environment. So I was very interested in this study, and I contacted the authors, and I did something that the New York Times op-ed board did not do, which is read the study. And what this study did is it really compared two types of badly done lamb. You know, bionic lamb in the United Kingdom had heavy inputs going into it, and these inputs were fed by coal power, because that dominates the United Kingdom. Therefore, they were dirty bionic lambs. In New Zealand, the lambs were getting all their inputs from clean green hydropower. So therefore, those lambs were nice lambs. But the point is that local lamb wasn't even an object of the study. A sustainable lamb model was not looked at. The other thing that was interesting is that the study was underwritten by the New Zealand Lamb Export Association. And this was their home run. Anyway, this is the kind of garbage that masquerades for serious analysis out there. And the truth is that it is, you know, even for those who say that transportation is a relatively small part, you know, 5–10% of the energy or carbon footprint, it still is something. And it doesn't make sense to just throw it away by not trying to localize your food system. Now, we did find challenges, and I want to highlight these challenges because I think these challenges, to a lesser or greater extent, are true in every community, every region that is looking at the local food system. How are we going to rebuild the infrastructure for local food? Like trolleys back in the 1920s, we ripped out of our cities the infrastructure for local processing and local distribution and the local milkman and the local grocer wholesaler. How do we rebuild all of that? Land. How do we possibly get more local food grown on land that is becoming scarcer? Consumer demand. How can we convince more consumers to buy more local more of the time? That's kind of a necessary part of the 25% shift. Capital. How can we mobilize all the money needed to finance this new generation of local food businesses? Entrepreneurship. Where are we going to find all of the new entrepreneurial leaders of these local food businesses and their workforce? Competitiveness. How are we going to deal with the fact that there's a perception, at least, if not a reality, that local food is too expensive? So I wanted to share a couple of preliminary thoughts about each of these, and I'll say more in a little bit as well. First of all, on infrastructure, I think as Leslie's presentation underscored, this is a central focus of local food initiatives around the country. And there's incredible innovations that people are doing now around distribution and storage and transportation and wholesaling. Land. What we found with land was interesting because the truth is that if you focus on a very small area like the city of Cleveland, it's extremely difficult for a city to feed itself. Although the truth is we could go a lot farther than we do now. And you know, most cities that have inventories of land that they look at and say, well, we could do urban farming there. These are just plots of abandoned land. They're not thinking at all about plots of occupied land that the owners might actually be happy if you use that for local farming. They're not thinking about rooftops or the sides of highways. So there's really a lot deeper analysis we need to do of availability of land. And of course, there's the sides of buildings as well. But the bigger issue with land use is that you got to think regionally. And if you start to move your analysis from your little neck of the woods to, say, 50 or 100 miles out, then the land issue gets somewhat resolved. The other things that resolve the issue are if you let go of the assumption that you must continue to export, you know, so much of your agricultural product, if you're willing to sell more of that locally produced product locally, that can help to resolve the land use issue. Also, if you shift your diet from a very meat-based diet to, you know, a lighter meat diet, that also can help resolve the land use issue. Consumer demand. There is no question that food stuffs that you find at a farmer's market today generally, not always, but generally are a little bit more expensive than what you find at a supermarket or a Walmart. But a couple of things need to be said about this. The first is that we are in a situation right now where demand for local food greatly exceeds the supply. And what's going to happen is as more people move into local food, that price is going to come down. And I know that's not great news for some of the farmers who are at farmers markets right now, but I think that is the reality that we're going to face. The other thing that needs to be said about local food that's a little bit pricier because it's higher quality is this is not a bad economic model. I mean, think about it. If it's, you know, no one chooses goods or services based on price. People choose goods or services based on value, okay? If people only chose goods or services based on price, Starbucks would not exist. Because Starbucks is the most expensive cup of coffee that you will find in any community you go into. So what Starbucks has done, right or wrong, is create a sense of good quality, good ambiance, you know, good ethical values that they bring into the coffee. I mean, we can raise lots of questions about this, but Starbucks as a model demonstrates the importance of quality. And that's really what we're about too. But, you know, no one says Starbucks is a really dumb economic model. And yet critics of local food say, gee, higher quality local food that costs a little bit more, it will never work. It's a total contradiction. Capital. All right, so I do want to say a little bit about capital right now. It turns out that we need about $1 billion of additional capital in the Cleveland area to finance the 25% shift. Now, $1 billion sounds like a lot of money, But it turns out that $1 billion in the 16-county area is about 1% of what's in people's bank accounts. And it's 1/4% of what's in people's pension funds. So let's do a little experiment here to see how well you are investing your money. By show of hands here, how many people have bought local something over the last week? Yeah, all right. Now by show of hands, how many people do their banking at a local bank or credit union? Okay, impressive. Now, those of you with pension funds, how many of you have invested your pension funds in local small business? 1, 2, okay, 3. Notice the hands are a little tentative because if I ask follow-up questions, they may go down. Okay. This is outrageous. This is indefensible. You should be embarrassed. You folks, the most locavorish folks of Virginia, are systematically over-investing in the Fortune 500 companies you distrust, and under-investing, that is not investing at all, in the local businesses you know are essential for community well-being. We got to fix this problem, and that's really a lot of what my talk tomorrow is going to be about, is how we can fix this problem. Entrepreneurship. We actually identified in the Cleveland area a bunch of really good entrepreneurial programs, a couple of which are focused on farming, but, you know, I'll tell you, just a little experiment. You know, you kind of walk the corridors of this workforce development building, and it really is very light on the agricultural side. You know, we define workforce as people who work for factories. But we need to define workforce in a much broader way and bring the food system front and center in what we do there. So finally, we have competitiveness. How can we little guys, we small farmers, small food producers, possibly compete against the sumo wrestlers of the global economy? And I want to focus on this for a couple of minutes, because I want to show you some surprising data. This chart here comes from Statistical Abstract. And what it shows is that the profit rate of sole proprietorships, which most small businesses are or start out as, are 3 times as high as the profit rates from C Corps, where most global companies are, with partnerships lying in between. Now, another slide I want to show you. If it were true that local small businesses were becoming less competitive in an era of globalization, over the last 20 years, we would have seen the number of jobs in this economy moving from small businesses to large businesses, because the large businesses would be more competitive. And in point of fact, here is what's happened between 1990 and 2008. So the red blob represents 500 plus employee businesses. These are large employee companies. The green blob is 100 employees, so those are small businesses. And the middle blob is 100 to 500 employees. So what we know about the green and the middle blob are that they are 99.9% locally owned. So that is the locally owned economy. And what you can see, if you pull out a little magnifying glass, is that indeed the large business part of the economy has about 2% more of the jobs. 2%. That's all that globalization did, is a 2% growth of the jobs there. Now, a couple of things to say about this. This occurred in a policy environment where economic development was tilted like a double diamond ski slope against local small business. I don't know if you had a chance to look at the wonderful New York Times articles that started on Sunday and have been coming out every day since then, basically showing what a fraud economic development is, how much of it is focused on wasting billions of dollars for corporate attraction and retention. Really, the only thing economic development has done is made local small businesses relatively less competitive. So in that environment, look at how remarkable local businesses did. It shows how resilient this sector was. Imagine if we had gotten public policy half right, how well these businesses would have done. And here's another point. This is employees. It does not include home-based businesses. And when you add in the fifth of our economy that is now home-based businesses, that has exploded spectacularly in the last 20 years, these curves move in another direction. So, despite economic development's best efforts to destroy local small business, they have prevailed. Last point I want to make has to do with models of economic success. The way that we analyze the U.S. economy, we have a little inventory called NACE, the North American Industrial Classification System. So there's 1,100 sectors of the economy, and every business gets inventoried by what it does and its size. If we ask the question, in how many of these 1,100 categories do we have more examples of competitive large business than small, the answer is a whopping 7. That is, in 1,093 categories, we have more examples of successful, competitive small businesses. So what are those 7 categories that are really, really hard to localize? Number 1 on the list, running your own central monetary system. Okay, you can't be the Fed. Number 2, running your own nuclear power plant. Number 3, missiles and rockets. Now, missiles and rockets is an interesting category because it turns out that there's about a dozen of these companies in the United States, and 3, 4 of them are small and locally owned. So that one actually is open to you. The point is that economic developers are very cavalier about this issue of economies of scale. They're looking at the average scale. Who cares about the average scale? What we should care about as a community is what is the right scale of a business that could work in my community or my region. And if you take that kind of analysis, you can find competitive models of success in every single sector of the economy, especially the food sectors. And that brings me to the second part of what I want to talk about, which is the report that I did with the Wallace Center on community food enterprises. We, under a grant from the Kellogg Foundation and from the Gates Foundation, looked at 24 local food businesses that we thought had interesting models of competitiveness. Half in the United States, half internationally. And I want to just briefly share with you a baker's dozen of these models. And these are all things you're familiar with, but I think it's good to put names on them because these are the reasons why many of us are winning in the competitiveness world right now. Number 1, innovation. Local food businesses have the ability to develop appropriate technology. In fact, we know that small businesses in general are much better at pioneering new technology and produce many more patents than do larger businesses. Our example of this was Anna Marie Seafood in Duloc, Louisiana, sole proprietorship. Here is a very innovative Fisher person who created an onboard freezing system, and this onboard freezing system led to a fresher product that made it popular with Ritz-Carlton hotels and a centerpiece at the New Orleans farmers markets. Number 2, direct delivery. There are many examples of this. The one we looked at was the Oklahoma Food Co-op as one way that people have made delivery from farm to table a lot faster and more efficient. And here I must talk economics, because distribution is one area where the global food system is remarkably inefficient. And this graph here, put together by Stuart Smith at the University of Maine, I think nicely captures it. What Smith shows is that back in the year 1900, when you spent $1 on foodstuffs, 40 cents went to the farmers, the rest went to inputs and marketing. 2006, look at $1 that's spent on food, about 7 cents went to the farmer. 73 cents went to various things that had to do with distribution. Distribution including transportation, refrigeration, packaging, insurance, retail markup, things that have nothing to do with food. Whenever the distribution number gets very large relative to production, there is an opportunity to cut costs through organizing it locally. And that's exactly what the Oklahoma Food Co-op has done. Once a month, they have an exquisite ballet that brings together hundreds of farms with thousands of consumers at drop-off points throughout the state. And their cost of doing this is not 73 cents on the dollar, it is 18 cents on the dollar. Number 3, aggregation. Aggregation is the story of Anthony Flaccavento's Appalachian Sustainable Development Initiative. Aggregation is also the story of Indian Springs, a producer cooperative in Mississippi, put together during the Civil Rights era that brought together 36 African-American farmers who were able together to build a fruit and vegetable processing, packaging, and then distribution plant. As a result of working together as a co-op, these farmers realized this is the only way they've stayed in business. And they have delivered something like $5,000 to $10,000 of economic benefit back to some of the poorest counties in rural Mississippi. Number 4, vertical integration. Not all local businesses are small or unsophisticated in terms of creating a kind of great ecosystem of businesses. And a great example we looked at was Zingerman's Delicatessen in Ann Arbor, Michigan. You know, for the first 10 years or so, Zingerman's was a successful deli, and they had a fork in the road. Are we going to become a chain like Schlotzsky's? They decided against it for 2 reasons. One is they cared about quality control. And they worried that they would lose that if they started to have chain branches all over the place. As Paul Saginaw, one of the founders of Zingerman, said, the last thing I want to do in my declining years is fly around the country and see second-rate versions of myself. The other reason was the people. The folks who ran Zingerman's loved the people and didn't want to lose that personal connection. So they decided that rather than growing wide, they would grow deep. And they looked at things coming into the deli and said, we could create businesses around it. We serve bread and sandwiches. We could create a bakehouse. We serve coffee. We could create a roasting company. We serve ice cream and cheese. We could create a creamery. Then they looked at things coming out of the deli and saw value-adding opportunities. We have great food. Why not create a sit-down restaurant called the Roadhouse? We have great cakes. We could create a mail-order cake service. We have great customer service. We could create a training module called Zing Train. So in all, Zingerman's is now not one business, but 9. Each is independently owned. The partners of each co-license the brand, and they come together as a way of keeping quality control in the network high. Collectively, Zingerman's employs 550 people, and their annual sales are over $30 million a year. Number 5, owner loyalty. You know, people say that generally speaking, local businesses have trouble finding money to finance themselves, and generally that's true. But one advantage that local businesses have in getting money is that they actually have a relationship with the people they're asking for the money from. So you see this in consumer co-ops all over the country. So we use the example of Weaver Street Market, a 13,000 person grocery grocery co-op in Carrboro, North Carolina. Those 13,000 members are investors. When they set up Weaver Street Market, they built it right next to a food line. They were not worried about the competition because they knew that people who were invested naturally have an incentive to do as much business as possible at the co-op and to encourage their neighbors to do their business at the co-op as well. Number 6, nimble, just in time. Local small businesses have the ability to act quickly and smartly in a way that a big global company cannot. Very pleased that we're joined tonight by Fred Kirschenman, who's going to be speaking tomorrow. Fred has spoken for years about the importance of middle-scale agriculture. And this is especially true in something like meat processing, where the scale of production is, significantly larger than in other food processing areas. But an example of, I think, a great ag-in-the-middle kind of company is Lawrence Meats in Cannon Falls, Minnesota, which created, I think, the smallest multi-species processing plant that the USDA has licensed. And the result of their business model is that, if someone needs a special kind of meat, elk or bison, they will go to the producers and get it processed immediately. There is no inventory that's lurking. There is no waste. This is instant processing, and that has kept the prices reasonable. Number 7, better access. The general view out there is that local food is more expensive and then therefore terrible for poor people. But I think what this overlooks is the fact that actually most people living in food deserts don't have access to anything. So when you put into these communities farmers markets, even if the food is a little pricier, it is still a better deal than what you're going to get at the corner bodega. And so an example of a great farmers market, the largest one in the country, is Green Market in New York City. Green Market has nearly 50 markets in the city. Half are opened throughout the year. And about a third of these markets, the primary participants in the market, the primary purchasers, are people on food stamps and WIC coupons. Number 8, better taste. This is kind of a no-brainer about local food. It tastes good, that's why people buy it. Many examples of this, probably we have many examples sitting in the room of this, where your local foodstuffs are, win on taste. We use an example of Aquenzi's Fish and More in Ontario. Andrew Aquenzi is a native fisher person. He and his family do the fishing, they bring it back, they smoke it, and then they sell it at various farmers markets in Toronto. As Andrew says, by the time my competitors are getting the bone out of the fish, my consumers, my customers are eating mine. So speed and quality are part of his model. Number 9, better stewardship. We mentioned this a little bit earlier. Farmers are the great stewards of the land. We thought a good model of this, an example of this, was the Intervale Center in Burlington, Vermont, which started out as really a kind of giant compost heap. They collected lots of old foodstuffs from Burlington, and they created a really good composting business out of it. And from that business, they were able to finance CSAs, farmers training programs, land rehabilitation programs. So it's an interesting nonprofit business model. Number 10, better labor practices. We think that local food businesses are worse with their workforces than larger businesses, that larger businesses pay more, have better benefits, and so forth. There may have been a time when that was true. I think that's becoming far less true. And you certainly can find great performers on labor standards among local businesses. Swantonberry Farms is a great example of this. Jim Cochran, who started Swantonberry Farms sort of in the middle coast of California, decided he wanted to market his strawberries based on the best labor standards imaginable. So he not only guaranteed the 50 people working on his farm health benefits, family leave time, retirement benefits, he actually invited the United Farm Workers to come in and organize his workforce. His neighbors thought he was crazy. But what he knew is that being able to market his strawberries as being among the best in terms of labor standards in California was going to attract a particularly devoted niche of customer. And Jim now plans to basically slowly peel off his ownership and put it into the hands of his workforce by the time he retires. Number 11, better service. Service is a big part of the food industry. It's not just foodstuffs per se. And a great example of where food service is taught and taught to be highly competitive is a high school in Paraguay run by a nonprofit called Fundación Paraguaya. And this high school had been losing money before it was taken over by this foundation. It was run by a convent. They took it over and decided we are going to make it into a local food business training program. So the kids in the program have to actually get hands-on experience with 16 different enterprises. You know, hotel service, milking cows, doing value-added businesses. And so by the time the kids come out, they become extremely skilled. But the amazing thing is that these businesses pay for the high school. These are real businesses. And this model has been so successful that the foundation is now spreading it through Latin America. Number 12, fun. Local businesses are more fun than the Walmarts of the world. And a great example of this is the White Dog Cafe in Philadelphia, run until recently by Judy Wicks, pictured there on the lower left. The White Dog Cafe is not just a cafe. It really was it was ground zero for the local food movement in Philadelphia. And it was done with a lot of humor. I mean, Judy put dog regalia throughout the entire restaurant. So you don't just order beer, you order leg lift lager. You don't just order wine, you order specially branded local snaggletooth wine. When you go to the restrooms, There are different gendered dogs that help you identify what room you're supposed to go into. Anyway, she has events almost every night at the White Dog. So it's become a kind of cultural organizing space as well. And one of the organizations that I'm a fellow of, Bali Business Alliance of Local Living Economies, got its start really with Judy and some other local businesses. So in a sense, it's kind of a landmark of the founding of local business movement in the United States. Last but not least, cabbages and condoms in Thailand. I have to be careful how I describe this, given that I'm in rural Virginia. I don't want an ultrasound performed on me. I'm sorry, bad joke. Cabbages and Condoms started out as one big Thai restaurant in Bangkok. And you go into this restaurant, and all of the tables have glass on top of them, and underneath the glass are rows of multicolored condoms. On the walls are blow-up balloon animals done with condoms. At the end of your meal, you get a dish full of condoms called condiments. It is totally in your face, but it's for a purpose. Because the money from this restaurant and 13 other restaurants and inns and resorts that go by the name generate more than $2 million that go into the largest AIDS education and reproductive rights program in Thailand. It's a little in your face. One of the things that Cabbages and Condoms reminds me of is that, if you're interested in social change, the last thing you want to do is start a nonprofit. Because nonprofits, if Cabbages and Condoms was a nonprofit funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, they would come down and say, can you guys tone it down a little bit? You're really offensive. These guys are a for-profit. They can be as out there as they want to be. And to me, that is liberating. All of us who run our for-profit should embrace them as the greatest source of liberation in the work that we want to do. So the last and very short thing that I want to finish with tonight is just an observation about how we pull all of this data together and begin to implement. And Leslie, myself, and Brad collected literally hundreds of ideas for implementation around the 25% shift that could be done by neighborhood groups, nonprofits, universities, businesses, policymakers. But at the end of the day, we were particularly interested in meta businesses. Again, the logic of Cabbages and Condoms. If you have a program that pays for itself, it's not going to be vulnerable to the next round of budget cutoffs that come from either the federal or state fiscal cliffs. If you are not dependent on a foundation grant, you have more certainty in your ability to survive year in, year out. So I want to just suggest some of the ideas that are out there in addressing the big problems that local food faces. So remember this list again: infrastructure, land, consumer demand, capital, entrepreneurship, and competitiveness. Well, infrastructure. Blue Ridge Produce is a great example of a cash-flowing infrastructure business launched by Jim Epstein. I don't know if he's here right now. There he is back there. A great model, and a model that others around the country are looking at. And I hope you have a chance to talk with Jim if you're interested in connecting with this sort of distributional model, not just in Virginia, but sort of in the greater mid-Atlantic state area. Land. We could create a business that buys lawn rights from homes. and has them used by early farmers. We should get, lawns are the biggest crop out there, totally wasteful. We should start turning that into a value-adding industry as a way of getting local farming off the ground. Consumer demand. We now have businesses out there that cash flow while encouraging people to buy local. Supportland is a loyalty card in Portland. It is so good at mobilizing people to buy from participating local businesses that the 200 local businesses that are part of it pay something like, I think like $50 a month for the privilege of being part of this. And every time you swipe your Supportland card at a local business, you build up points that are useful for other goods and services at other businesses. Bernal Bucks is a local debit card issued by a credit union in Bernal Heights, a neighborhood in San Francisco. And every time you use this local debit card, you build up points that give you discounts at other local businesses. The thing that's neat about Bernal Bucks is, and the model, the underlying economic model, is that the neighborhood group convinced the bank, that is the credit union, that the percentage that they get on every transaction should be given to the community group. And the community group then goes out and uses that money to mobilize people to use the card for local purchasing. Capital. This is my new best friend, Michael Van Patten, founder of Mission Markets, which is now prepared to create a local stock market for your area or any area of the country. And I'll talk more about what Michael is offering tomorrow and why that matters. But this is a cash flowing model that will make it easier and cheaper for small businesses to find debt and find equity finance from their friends and neighbors in the area. Now, if we get our local capital markets working, one of the things that can start happening is all the great incubators that Leslie, Johnny Appleseed style, is planting around the country can possibly be self-financed, because those incubators, as part of the incubation, could create a local stock issue around the businesses, so that upon graduation, one of Leslie's incubators maybe gets 5 or 10% ownership shares of the company. And then they can sell those shares out, cash comes back, and the money is available for the next round of incubation. Even competitiveness can be promoted in a very business-friendly way. Tucson Originals is a group of local food businesses in Tucson, Arizona, that collectively buy foodstuffs, kitchen equipment, dishes, and thereby, by buying in bulk, bring down their unit costs. And this improves competitiveness. So my point here is, there's, for almost every element of building a local food system, there are at least 2 ways of doing it. One way is you beg for money from foundations and government agencies, and you won't be able to do it for very long. The other way is think creatively about a business model and seize it. And if you look around the country, you will find lots of really interesting business models out there. To accomplish this is not easy. I'm not pretending this is easy. I'm not pretending the 25% shift will come by just waving our magic wand. All of us are working exceedingly hard to make this happen. But it can happen, I think, if we focus on it. And I come back to our friend Drew Carey, because we as a movement are really at a very critical point. I think, we've been in this field long enough that we recognize some of the really deep challenges in getting to 25%. When Carey reached a challenging point in his diet, he decided he would reward himself for bad behavior. So, he said, okay, after I lose my first 50 pounds, I'm going to have a pizza. lost the 50 pounds, had a pizza. Then he thought, you know what? Maybe I'll get some ice cream too. And then another pizza. And then after about a day of doing this gorging, he felt absolutely awful. He learned a lesson that he posted on a note above his bathroom mirror. And he said, eating crappy food is not a reward. It's a punishment. And I would say that having a crappy food system is not a reward to anyone in the economy. It is a punishment to all of our friends and our neighbors. I believe that through focus, we have the ability to transform ourselves into job creators, environmental preservers, and into the eliminators of food deserts across the state of Virginia. As Pogo said, we're confronted by insurmountable opportunities. The next step is yours. Thank you very much. Do we have time and the ability to do some questions?
Yes, we do. If anybody would have a question, I have a microphone here. We're trying to tape the discussion. Any questions?
Or comments, tomatoes, contradictions?
Clarify.
I've read most of your books and they're very interesting. I'm a big fan, but what I've noticed is that there's a lot of focuses, for example, in the last one you talked about Cleveland. The area that I'm from is very rural, very economically depressed. How do you apply that model, or are there studies or things that we can look at to apply to an area that doesn't have the diversity that a Cleveland would bring?
Yes. So it turns out, interestingly, I think I have found myself more in small rural towns than I have in bigger cities in the last few years. I probably haven't written about them as much, but I need to. But one area where I'm doing some work now is Eastern Kentucky. And so there's a group of us, kind of based in the University of Kentucky and the Appalachian Center there, and we're trying to organize a multi-county business alliance with small businesses there. And I have to say, it's an exceedingly difficult task, because in an urban area, you can go 10 blocks and you've got a critical mass of businesses for a local business movement. In rural communities, you have to go very long distances. Building those relationships is tough. On the other hand, I think that there are underlying relationships there, and people understand the value at some intuitive and instinctive level about preserving the community and buying local. I think all of the same principles apply to a rural community, except that you may have to figure out how to work over a larger region to achieve the economies of scale for some of these initiatives to really work. But I have to say, some of these initiatives don't require very large economies of scale. I don't think, for example, a local gift card or a loyalty card requires a huge economy of scale. A local stock market, yes, we're probably talking like maybe the state of Virginia can withstand to have one or two of those.
Another question here.
How did you define a 25% shift to local food in Cleveland? What does that mean?
Yeah, good question. So remember I said earlier that the economy, one way we can look at the economy is through these NACE sectors. Again, North American Industrial Classification System. Of those 1,100 categories, there's about 100 categories that are related to food, mostly in manufacturing. We looked at the actual employment in each sector, and we looked at the expected employment. Were there self-reliance? in the community without changing the degree of exports. So we took exports as a given. But if you were to increase production so that there would be total self-reliance there would be a certain number of jobs implied. And so a 25% shift was going from the existing level of employment 1/4 of the way to the idealized level of employment in food sectors. And then through what are called indirect effects and induced effects, that is through business spending and consumer spending, there are additional jobs that are then multiplied and created in the economy. We looked at those as well.
Would there be any other questions for Michael?
We might be talking about this a lot more tomorrow, but you were talking about the local stock exchanges and also the food incubators as having a way to trade equity in these companies. And I guess I'm a little bit more nervous about encouraging equity, particularly for locally owned food businesses. So should we earmark that for tomorrow's conversation, or do you want to open that can of worms now?
Yeah, no, I'm nervous too, and I'm nervous about doing a lot of equity investment around startup businesses. But you know, that the model of bringing outside finance into these businesses, you could do it with debt, you could do it with royalty finance. So, you know, whatever model makes you happy, we could build that into the incubator.
Any other questions? Well, let's
Wait, Dr. Epstein.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your plug. Appreciate it.
Just a comment really about the local food world. The USDA did a study of how much of our total food system is local. Would you guess that it's 1%? It's not very big. If we focus down on produce in the Washington metropolitan areas, we're talking Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and DC, that is about $16.8 billion. Of that, about 7% is local. So a 1% shift represents about $168 million. There is incredible opportunities in 1%. And so if we can get up to 25%, it would be fabulous. But I think even in this food sector, we could look at shifting 1%, 2%, 3%. It's an extraordinary opportunity that we have. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, I think that it's a good point. And one thing I would say is that these percentages are really interesting data, because when you focus, as Jim did there, and totally accurately, on fresh foodstuffs, what percentage of fresh foodstuffs are reaching people locally, it is a very small percentage. But when you start looking at the other parts of the food system, when you start adding in the distribution or grocery stores or restaurants, those numbers tend to be very high. Now, there still are additional things that one can do with localizing them. That is, if we look at restaurants, we could say, gee, we have all the restaurants we need here if we want to eat out, but then we could start converting the Applebee's into local restaurants, and that would have a positive economic impact. So that's another kind of percentage one might think about. So, but the point, I sometimes like to think about the whole food system rather than just the fresh food, because it helps us to appreciate that there's a lot of local food businesses right now on top of the farming sector that should give us some sense of power and reach that we can go just a little bit further. So both numbers are used, both the large numbers and the small numbers are useful for us for different purposes.
You talked about Walmart selling local food and how that was not really helping the local economy. Kind of flip that on its head for agriculture. Rockingham County is a huge livestock beef, dairy, poultry production area, and I've heard that if they were to feed those animals the corn that grows in Virginia, it would last for about a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks. So kind of the inputs have to come from somewhere else. I don't know, is that something you could speak to?
Yeah, well, you know, it goes a little bit to the land analysis that I was talking about in Cleveland, or that comes out in a lot of these local food studies. And that is that, you know, when you dig underneath, some of the really hard things to localize are the land required for the animals that we eat and the grains required to feed those animals. And so it turns out, I mean, you know, I am a very happy and content meat eater, so I'm not pushing anyone to go vegetarian or vegan, but I do have to concede that thinking about shifts in our diet is a way to make localization easier. So we may find ways of creating more grains to feed animals, but it probably will be, that is Virginia grains to feed Virginia animals. But on the other hand, it may just be easier to, you know, gradually wean ourselves off of, you know, 10 helpings of beef a week.
Or feed the cattle grass.
Or feed the grass, right, yes, thank you, thank you.
Hi, I certainly agree with your idea of eating a more plant-based diet. I work for the Virginia Department of Health, and I'm also the president of the Lynchburg Area Food Council. And so an issue, or I guess pick your brain, all the work that you've done in research, have you come across policies or incentives that local governments can do to make it easier to promote commercial food enterprises?
Commercial food, well, to me there are, I mean, you know, there's a million policies that local government can do, state government can do. But here are three that I think are the most important, okay? And I'm sure they're on your list already. So I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But number one is end economic development as we know it. And focus all of that money that, you know, Bob McDonald and his counterpart in Maryland are wasting on corporate attraction in a war with each other, and spend that money on the nurturing of local businesses, increasingly local food businesses. Number two, we've changed, we'll talk about this tomorrow, national securities laws to make it easier for most of us to put money into local food businesses. We have not changed state securities laws. And so there are a bunch of easy fixes that the state can do in order to improve the ability of the 99% of us who are unaccredited investors to put small amounts of money into promising local food businesses. Number three, procurement. There is a dumb way to do local procurement, and there's a smart way. The dumb way is being practiced all over the country, and that is to do across the board percentages of advantage that we confer on local businesses. So say in Washington, D.C., if you are a local business bidding on a municipal contract, we'll give you a 5% advantage. The reason why it's dumb is that it will never hold up in courts, okay? There's already, just in the last month, there has been a holding in the World Trade Organization on similar energy kinds of advantages that Ontario has given in the name of energy efficiency. It's just a matter of time before the monster known as the WTO wipes these things out. So we have to think more creatively about how to work around the monster. And I think the way to do it is when someone bids on, say, a Virginia contract, they should represent what % of that contract money will be spent in state. We then run a little bit of an economic analysis at the state level on that to determine how much additional tax money will we collect as a result of that. And so the actual bid of a company will be its nominal bid minus the expected taxes from that contract. And what will happen is that any company that promises to spend a lot of the money locally will get a big advantage. And it's a defensible advantage under the WTO regulations. One reason for this is that if I was a Taiwanese company and came in under this kind of rule, I could say, I'm going to spend all my money in Virginia and look very good under it and compete. So it's not discriminatory. The truth is there's no Taiwanese company that will do that. So at the end of the day, this is a way of really benefiting local businesses. And if we get government procurement, on a good trajectory, the rest is going to be simple.